This is the AH-64 Apache, the very pinnacle of the attack helicopter concept, perfected over 4 decades. 2,700 have been built for the United States, Israel, Taiwan, and beyond since the 1980s. But since then, the enemy has developed new, high-tech air defense networks with a range of over 300 kilometers. Some even go as far as to say the entire concept of attack helicopters is obsolete. The concern isn't just coming from hot takes online, because the Japanese Ministry of Defense 2023 policy update states they're no longer going to use obsolete attack helicopters and will instead use unmanned drones. And the fact that 1/8 of Russia's attack helicopters, or about 88, were destroyed in Ukraine didn't help the platform's case. But even though attack helicopters are more vulnerable than ever before, new doctrine, tactics, and technology can help make up for it. But I actually think attack helicopters will be used now more than ever before because of the unpredictable nature of threats in the Middle East, Europe, and remote islands in the South China Sea. Where did this concept of using helicopters in offensive action first come from, and has the platform always had this inherent vulnerability to it? Well, the very first documented instance happened in the Korean War when Marines were reported to fire their individual rifles out of the back of an AH-19 transport in the early 1950s. Sounds like something Marines would do. Then the French took the first steps beyond small arms when they equipped a utility chopper with unguided rockets in 1956. But it wasn't until 1963, when Defense Secretary Robert S. McNamara launched the House Board Air Mobility Concept Study that created the foundation for attack helicopter doctrine. Doctrine. What is a doctrine? Doctrine is a set of standardized procedures that guide your decision-making, training, and execution of missions. You can think of military doctrine sort of like a playbook or game plan for a country's military. The House Board created an experimental air assault division and some of the initial rules or doctrine that would dictate how attack helicopters function. The paper Optimize Attack Aviation Battle Command in Deep Operations states that this division ultimately evolved to become the 1st Cavalry Air Mobile Division, which was activated and sent to Vietnam in the summer of 1965. As a result, air mobility and the helicopter were inextricably linked, with a modified UH-1 gunship dedicated to providing the ground commander with close-in fire support. So to oversimplify this, the whole reason this concept was created was to solve the problem of transporting troops to the battle quickly over impassable jungle terrain. By combining infantry with helicopters, you didn't need to construct a whole airfield, and you didn't need to designate an expensive jet bomber for protection. The UH-1 was mainly used for transport and medevac roles. They flew as slow as 90 miles per hour and only had 2 mounted machine guns, which explains their designation, UH, meaning utility helicopter. But a revolution would need to occur. They would need to double their speed, double their ammunition payload, and triple the amount of time they could linger over a target area to become a real offensive combat capability. And that's exactly what they did. This is the Bell H-1 Cobra, introduced in 1967, AH meaning attack helicopter. It was the US military's first purpose-built attack helicopter that would pave the way for the Apache. For example, the Cobra fleet operated in excess of 1 million operational hours during the entire war, knocking out escort missions, reconnaissance, and close air support roles. However, on the other hand, roughly 300 of those Cobras were destroyed in combat. In fact, 5,000 helicopters were destroyed during the Vietnam War out of 12,000 that saw action. 4,800 helicopter pilots and crew members were KIA out of 100,000, which is 4.8%, a relatively high number. It's true that many were down by mechanical failures instead of being shot down, but it still goes to show that the platform was seen as vulnerable in rough conditions right from the start. Vulnerabilities aside though, the advantage of attack helicopter compared to fixed-wing aircraft is pretty simple. It can take off vertically without a runway, hover over a target for a prolonged period of time, and perform more agile maneuvers. Penguins isn't watching car chases recorded from police airplanes, he's watching them from police helicopters. But there's a confusing gray area issue that popped up with the concept of attack helicopters. The fact that the Army and Marine Corps operate aircraft and helicopters is a little bit weird, considering that the whole point of the Air Force is to provide air support. Shouldn't the Air Force be the only one in charge of helicopters? Should the Army have any of those capabilities, or should they be forced to call up their buddies in the Air Force each time? Isn't all of this a petty distinction? No, because whoever won would dictate the doctrine and capabilities of attack aircraft. So there's actually a policy from 1948 called the Key West Agreement. In it, it specifies exactly how the different assets of the Army, Navy, and Air Force are to be used to ensure mutual support with maximum efficiencies between the services. The Air Force is understandably very defensive about any project from other branches that they see as infringing on their whole reason for being. This is why the development of attack helicopters in the 1970s was a major point of contention between the two branches. From the research paper Attack Helicopter Operations in Urban Terrain, the Air Force perspective of this debate was that equipping Army helicopters with weapons was an unnecessary redundancy with an inferior weapons platform that already had a low probability of survival on the battlefield. On the other side of the argument, though, the Army drew a distinction between close air support, which would provide large volumes of ordnance, and aerial fire support, which would be capable of discriminatory firepower in close proximity to ground combat elements. This distinction continues all the way to today. We're getting to see the development of attack helicopter doctrine right now play out in front of us in real time, and I find that fascinating. The Army continued work on their Advanced Aerial Fire Support System project to replace the Cobra. This produced the helicopter fixed-wing hybrid, the AH-64 Cheyenne. It might have been able to survive enemy fire, but what it couldn't survive was this Army and Air Force politics. The United States Air Force contested the adoption of the AH-64 every step of the way. They argued to the U.S. Senate Armed Forces Committee that it was redundant. There were also issues with the AH-64 digital controls and size that finally led to the project's cancellation in August 1972. Then, we see the Army launch the Advanced Attack Helicopter program in 1972. That would eventually become the Apache. This time, the service had less of a focus on raw speed and emphasized anti-armor firepower along with greater survivability, night fighting abilities, and endurance. The experience gained from the war in Vietnam and the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, coupled with the Soviet armored buildup in Central Europe at the time, all influenced the Apache helicopter's engineering that was going to be focused on this agile anti-tank weapon capabilities. The first deliveries of the new AH-64 Apache chopper arrived in 1984 at an average unit cost of $13.9 million. The Apache wouldn't have to wait long for its first combat mission, though, deploying to Panama in 1989 for Operation Just Cause. The war confirmed the new Hellfire missiles were as accurate and powerful as advertised. In fact, the chopper was specifically designed from the ground up as a durable night fighter. Even the first versions of the Apache had the best thermal and night vision technology around. This forum, frequented by Apache helicopter pilots, explains just how impressive the Apache is. The Cobra is faster, but that means nothing on the battlefield. Armor, weapons, and loiter time mean 10 times as much as top speed. When you get into a fight in a helicopter, you aren't yanking and banking like an F-16 in a dogfight. Helicopters are best used when loitering outside of visual and audio range, using superb sensors and very accurate munitions to strike an unsuspecting enemy. Another aspect the Apache excels at, the 30mm cannon is ridiculously accurate. I've fired 50-round bursts at 4,000 meters, and not only do all rounds land within 20 meters of each other, they also land about that distance of the point of aim. So why does having a great distance of 4,000 meters really matter, though? When we consider that the flight ceiling or max altitude for the Apache is 6,000 meters by the book, that means the Apache is able to loiter from a standoff distance safely away from the target. Enemy manned portable systems like most advanced IGLA-S claims to be able to just barely hit targets at 6,000 meters. When I was in Iraq, my platoon had an Apache element attached to us, providing close air support. They went by the code name Extreme Element. And even though they sounded like they were listening to Smash Mouth tapes while murking the enemy, they were the most calm and chill, professional dudes you'd ever heard on the radio net. I saw them rain down 30mm cannon fire onto insurgents. It's like watching God throw automatic thunder fire bolts. The effect on target is devastating. In 1991, with Operation Desert Storm, the Apache fired some of the very first shots of the entire war by suppressing enemy radars and air defense systems to allow U.S. Special Forces teams to infiltrate Iraqi lines. The helicopter's 164 knot speed might not be as impressive on paper as the blazing fast 212 knots that its predecessor was capable of, but Apache pilots trained to use the tactic of flying as low as 5 feet off the ground at top speed to maximize cover from terrain. They almost always fly near their maximum gross weight, which is 17,650 pounds, to keep pilots trained on how to handle it with full weapons payloads. The Apache uses twin T700 turboshaft engines that deliver 1,500 shaft horsepower each. Sure, it's a heavy bird, but surprisingly agile, able to do barrel rolls, power climbs, and loops when in the right hands. This maneuverability isn't just for air shows either. It helps pilots follow the terrain and stay close to the ground when flying nap of the earth to avoid enemy radars and SAM systems. Twin engines and a composite armor screen around the cockpit give the AH-64 added survivability for when things get really hairy. Apaches would destroy more than 500 Iraqi enemy tanks and vehicles over the course of Desert Storm. Only one helicopter was shot down thanks to a lucky hit from an RPG. Both pilots survived the hit and were able to crash land. This helps support the theory that the added survivability built into the Apache was well worth the investment. When it comes to loitering time on target, the exact number for the Apache is going to be confidential, but open source information suggests that about 2.5 hours on target when fully loaded, or another rule of thumb is pilots often plan for about 3 hours of total flight time. And 3 hours worked pretty well for my platoon's purposes in Iraq, because most of our presence patrols lasted about 3 hours before we would return back to base. It's also cheaper by most metrics. For context, the cost of flying an F-35 per hour is $45,000. Meanwhile, it's only $3,000 per hour for an Apache Attack Helicopter. The effect of the Apache helicopter was on full display for the world, and this led to Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom all purchasing their own variants of the Apache during the 1990s. When it comes to firepower, there's a reason the Apache is called a gunship. While most attack helicopters around the world mount like a 20 or 23mm cannon, the Apache's 30mm M230 chain gun packs extra punch, firing special high-explosive dual-purpose rounds. I've seen what Apache HEDP rounds do to soft targets, and it's not pretty. You don't have to land a direct hit. All you need to do is be within 4 meters or 13 feet with one round to have an effect on enemy infantry with this 30mm explosive munition. The M230 cannon can deal with light armored targets like APCs and armored cars that would shrug off purely high explosive ammo. Estimated penetration performance is in excess of 50mm of RHA steel at a distance of 2,500 meters. Ammo capacity is about 1,200 rounds with a rate of fire of 300 rounds per minute before you have to wait to cool off the barrels for 10 minutes. But you might be familiar with this 30mm cannon already, and not because of its successful missions, but because of its controversial ones. Gunships in the United States and Israel Defense Force were implicated in several high-profile incidents, partly because these guns have a camera attached to them that record everything. It's like how police officers have cameras on them now, except for helicopter guns. The actual purpose is so defense experts can analyze the effectiveness of the weapons, but what ends up happening is the footage gets leaked by someone who has access to the files. I'm talking, of course, about the infamous collateral murder video, which was actually WikiLeaks' first viral video. It showed leaked gun camera footage from 2 American Apaches attacking Iraqi civilians with 30mm rounds and Hellfire missiles. A detailed legal investigation cleared the pilots of any wrongdoing, but no matter what your thoughts were on the incident, the damage to public perception had already been done, and the Iraq War was already unpopular at home at the time. The Apache was also in hot water in 2002 when the Human Rights Watch group lobbied the US government to stop the sale of Apaches to Israel after they were documented shooting at civilian homes. Further charges of human rights violations caused the Obama administration to delay the sale of further D variants of the Apache to Israel out of concern that they would be used against civilians in Gaza. To give you an idea of how secure these gun camera recordings are, I got a copy of the footage of our Apache element engagement within within 2 days. I was a 19-year-old, the lowest ranking private, and I got access to this shoot camera footage through the grapevine. That's how secure OPSEC was. It's tough to tell if Apaches truly increase or decrease the risk of collateral damage compared to your older, more traditional weapon systems like artillery. I believe the Apaches decrease the chances of accidents. But since artillery doesn't have a dedicated camera recording attached to each shell fired, we just don't know. Apaches were leaned on instead of weapon systems like cannon artillery because technically they're more accurate. Attack helicopters have a more clear picture of the target, and their high angle of attack makes them easier to observe, track, and hit targets in urban terrain. The insurgents who ran from the Apaches in the instance that I witnessed tracked the survivors as they tried to escape into a nearby village. Thanks to the Apache surveillance, they were able to be detained. For this surveillance, both Apache crewmen can control the gun using integrated helmet sights that automatically swivel the gun to wherever the pilot or gunner is looking for faster engagement times. But how would these fare against harder targets like main battle tanks? The AH-64 carries up to 16 Hellfire missiles that can obliterate any contemporary armored target from 8 kilometers away with laser-guided precision. To give you some context of why Hellfires are so devastating, they're huge at 7 inches in diameter and 5 feet across. Most other attack helicopters around the world can't carry anywhere near that amount of weight, usually only having 2 or 4 anti-tank missiles. The 4 hardpoints on the Apache's stub wings can also be configured with different types of ordnance, including Hydra rocket pods or AIM-92 Stinger air-to-air missiles. You might be wondering, why would you want a smaller 2.7-inch diameter unguided Hydra rocket? But it's because they're used for saturation attacks, to engage multiple targets hiding in a forest, for instance. This allows you to suppress enemy air defense systems in a wide area. We talked a fair bit about doctrine, but what about the main tactics that the Apache uses? Doctrine is a high-level planning, like what type of targets your attack helicopter should prioritize. On the other hand, tactics are like the specific moves that soldiers make on the battlefield to follow the game plan or doctrine. Tactics are the nitty-gritty stuff that govern how you carry out the broader strategies outlined in the playbook. It's called the pop-up attack, where you hide your Apache behind a mountain or terrain feature and then pop up just long enough to get a target lock and launch a fire-and-forget missile before ducking down below cover again. The longbow millimeter wave fire control radar is what allows the helicopter to peek above ridgetops and acquire a detailed picture of the battlefield that pierces through rain and dense fog. This radar can track 128 separate targets and lock onto 16 at a time for engagements. And an integrated aided target identification and classification system can automatically prioritize contacts based on threat levels. Targeting data is shared among allied Apaches, allowing one to spot targets while others remain hidden. But it's actually a common misconception that Apache crews have dedicated pilot and gunner roles. In truth, both crew are trained and qualified to sit in either seat, and the chopper can be flown from either the front or back seat. That said, the front seat does have access to the TADS imaging system for more accurate gunnery, while the back seat has better overall visibility for flying, so they're often informally called the pilot and gunner seats. The Apache, like many artists, has had to reinvent itself many times. It was originally developed as an anti-tank weapon against large Soviet columns of tanks, but when the Soviet Union collapsed shortly afterwards in 1991, there were serious concerns at the time about how the attack helicopter concept would be used in the future. I found an entire research paper thesis written in 1994 about how attack helicopter concept was thrown into limbo after the fall of the Soviet Union. With the benefit of hindsight, of course, we know that the US military shifted to counterinsurgency focus, and they proved to be useful in just a show of force mission, with the psychological effects of simply hearing an Apache overhead sending the enemy running. Now, fast forward to 2023, and the Apache is once again in a position where it has to reinvent itself. Ultimately, 15 Apaches were destroyed by hostile fire in the Iraq War, and another 15 were destroyed in Afghanistan, mainly due to crash landings. These were considered relatively low numbers, but the concern was these helicopters would be more vulnerable in the next conflict. Air defense systems and radar networks have also gotten a lot more sophisticated from the days of the Cold War. The Apache answers this dilemma. Combining tactics and doctrine with new technology ties this whole piece together. The AH-64 Echo variant introduced a whole slew of avionics upgrades specifically designed to make the attack helicopter survivable against a near peer. The new Apache is nicknamed nicknamed the Guardian. It has more powerful engines that deliver 1,994 shaft horsepower each, with a beefier transmission to deal with extra force. The upgrade also adds new composite rotor blades rated to withstand direct hits from 23mm autocannons, which is the most common caliber of Soviet-era anti-aircraft guns. A redesigned thermal suppression manifold called the Black Hole reduces the Guardian's IR signature. The MTADs, for modernized target acquisition and designated sight, in the nose of the Apache adds higher resolution images and a color imager. Thermals are great for seeing enemies in the dark, but useless for reading something like a street sign. So this fixes that problem. But the most futuristic addition is the Unmanned Team System, or MUMT. This transforms the Apache into a mobile drone controller, able to directly control up to 2 UAVs to conduct strikes in high-risk areas. Like any piece of military equipment, just because something on the battlefield can be neutralized and destroyed, like helicopters, doesn't make it useless. You have to look at what a system can deliver that nothing else can do to truly judge its usefulness. Naysayers have been loudly proclaiming the end of the attack helicopter based on how many have been shot down over Ukraine. But I prefer to look at the data from another angle. Militaries invest so much in air defense systems precisely because of how much damage an uncontested attack helicopter can wreak if they didn't. The Apache, with its sophisticated sensors, powerful armament, and highly trained crews, is the ultimate hunter-killer. And in the AH-64E version, the Apache isn't just another aging Cold War warrior, but an advanced apex predator that will stalk the night for many years to come. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. For more updates, follow me at CappyArmy on Instagram, and watch one of these videos that we have for you here. Ending transmission time now.